Whitaker was 9 years old. She lived in an old 2-story gray house at the end of a dirt road called Cemetery Lane. The name of the road was very fitting. Directly opposite of Hannah's home was the town's only cemetery, filled with fading, weathered headstones dating back to the mid-1800s, and surrounded by a toothy black iron fence that protected the graveyard like an army of thin tribal lances. The cemetery had not seen a new permanent guest in a long time. No one had been buried in the old graveyard for nearly 50 years. Often, particularly on evenings when the sun was setting and slipping beneath the trees, Hannah stared out of her bedroom window on the second floor of her house, gazing down at the old headstones, wondering about the people who had been buried there. She marveled at the fact that only a few dozen feet away were the ancient remains of the dead. I wonder what they look like, she would think some evenings as her nose pressed against the cold glass while the night drew closer and closer, its fingers of darkness slipping quietly over the nearby town, around the trees and over the houses and the people that inhabited them. Night closed its mysterious fist around the graveyard, holding it still and quiet, serene and soft, the blackness shrouding the decaying headstones within the old iron fence like a cool, dark blanket. But of course, this went unnoticed to those whose resting place was 6 feet in the ground opposite the Whitaker household on the other side of Cemetery Lane. The dead slumbered on eternally as the sun rose and the sun set. They rested peacefully, season after season, through the most violent of storms. Those dead and buried were indifferent to cold, fierce winds and heavy driving rains, and the thick drape of snow that fell in late November, creating a carpeting of white, capping the gravestones with tall crowns of frosting until spring, when the temperatures warmed and winter was whisked away by April's rain showers and the sunny days of May. Yes, those who inhabited the cemetery across the street from the old Whitaker house slumbered on as the days ticked by. They were there, day after day, month after month, year after year, long dead, buried in the ground, as still as a shadow and as quiet as a blade of grass at dawn. Until last summer. It had been decided by the village council with overwhelming approval that the old graveyard, the headstones and those who had been resting there for so many years, be moved to another location on the other side of town to make way for a new housing development. The procedure would be simple. First, the headstones would be carefully removed and taken to the new location, followed by the cautious, delicate extraction of the coffins and caskets within the ground. They would be transported to the other side of the village and carefully reburied in a newer final resting place. A few townsfolk had expressed their disapproval. Mainly, these cries of protest came from the older generation, those who had lived in the town for decades and had known or even had friends or relatives buried in the old cemetery at the end of the lane. In the end, however, these thin voices of disapproval faded away. Progress has no patience, some said, and others agreed. Change was inevitable, change couldn't be stopped, and besides, the new housing project would bring jobs to the area. When complete, new families would move in, bringing their shiny cars and their boisterous children, their playful dogs and their sweet, quiet kitties. The air would be filled with the familiar aromas of freshly mowed lawns and tangy barbecues, all beneath the majestic oaks and maples and the watchful eye of the sun. Yes, more houses would mean very good things for the tiny village. Still, Hannah looked upon this upcoming project with unbalanced emotions. She would miss the quiet afternoons when she walked through the graveyard and looked at the headstones, reading the names of those long since passed, staring at her shoes and marveling that just a few feet below them was a box made of wood or steel or cement, a box that contained what once had been a living, breathing human being, someone who had also walked the earth, much like Hannah, much like her family. She would miss the times when she would sit on a headstone as the sun set, waiting to see if possibly something would move out of the corner of her eye, something strange and mysterious, something delightfully cold and curious, supernatural and otherworldly. Of course, Hannah saw no such things, but she relished the delicious fright these evenings brought as the sun set, the moon rose, the stars twinkled, and bats flitted through the night sky. All of this she would miss. Still, new houses would mean new people, young people. Perhaps, Hannah thought, new friends. There were no houses near the Whitaker home, and Hannah had no friends her age. She was often lonely, and frequently wished she had a friend to share the days with. Maybe someone her age to run and play through backyards, to chase colorful butterflies through even more colorful gardens, and catch wart-covered toads hiding within the shrubbery. For years, as long as she could remember, no one else lived near her home on Cemetery Lane. No young person came knocking on her door, inviting her to play. She could not run to the house of a friend and do the same. New houses would mean new families and new friends, but in the meantime, Hannah was very, very lonely. On June 2nd of last summer, excavation was scheduled to begin at the old cemetery. On June 1st, the night before, Hannah took one final walk through the graveyard. The sun was setting in a carnival of colors in the western sky. The trees were still and meditating, and she felt a hint of sadness, wondering if those in the ground a few feet below would take offense to being moved. Would they mind being taken from their final resting place and deposited several miles away? No, she told herself. They're dead. They're dead, and dead people don't mind. They don't mind at all. The next day, June 2nd, brought a flurry of activity in the form of large yellow trucks, bulldozers with their massive blades, and backhoes with their heavy steel teacups and teeth designed to ravage the earth and dig holes with a frenzy and fury that no human could do with their hands. In no time at all, the headstones had been carefully removed, the graves meticulously plotted so that there would be no confusion as to who would be reburied where and with what gravestone. Much care and reverence was given to those who had resided in the old cemetery for so very, very long. The headstones were loaded on flatbed semi-trucks that slowly crawled up Cemetery Lane like giant diesel-powered caterpillars, bound for a large field on the opposite side of the village. The coffins and the caskets, still nestled in the ground, were the last to be moved. This process, of course, was a more difficult task than the simple removal of the headstones and required several days. Hannah watched, sometimes from the edge of her front yard, sometimes from her bedroom window, her nose and cheek pressed against the cool glass, as the cranes unearthed the heavy boxes and raised them into the air with the aid of great chains. Slowly and methodically, with great care, the caskets and coffins were transferred to waiting flatbed trucks. They were stacked 3 and 4 high, and over a dozen placed on each truck. When the final casket had been loaded and hauled away, Hannah looked at what once had been a green, well-kept cemetery, a graveyard filled with red, white, and blue American flags, colorful flowers, faded gravestones, and gray crosses. None of this remained. The cemetery across from her house had become a large tract of clumped, uneven dirt, bulging here, sinking there. Within weeks, the entire area opposite the Whitaker house would be torn up, trees cut down, new roads made. Homes would begin to pop up overnight like mushrooms after a warm rain. That night, after the final casket had been removed, after the trucks had been idled and set sleeping on the roadside like enormous steel insects, after the workers had gone home to their wives and their children and their suppers and their popcorn and soft drinks and movies, Hannah slipped silently between the vehicles and walked, barefoot, through the cold, clammy, freshly turned dirt. The sun fell. The moon rose. Hannah went to bed. She slept. It was around midnight when she was awakened by something. Just what that something was, she didn't know. A sound? A thirst? She wasn't sure. Moonbeams slipped through her window and painted her bed blue, casting whispers of shadows about her room. She sat up in bed, then stood. Barefoot, she walked across the cold wood floor to her bedroom window and stared down. There, in the gloomy darkness, in the lumps and mountains of dirt that had once been a beautiful, peaceful cemetery, things were moving. Strange things, hazy things, forms and figures moving in the darkness like dreams. Hannah closed her eyes and rubbed them. Then she opened them and stared in disbelief. In the wide space of what once had been an old graveyard, a crowd had gathered. People were milling about, walking slowly, zombie-like through the newly upturned dirt, around the stalled work trucks idled at the edge of the lane. Some were walking on the road in front of Hannah's house and by the driveway. All of these figures were a milky white, and they shimmered in the dull moonlight. Transfixed by horror and amazement, Hannah watched as the crowd continued to grow. More figures arrived by coming up through the ground, rising up through the dirt as easily as if they were slipping through nothing but a curtain of smoke. Most of these ghostly figures appeared to be adults, but Hannah could make out the forms of smaller people, children and young adults mingling among the crowd. Terrified, but unable to turn away from the bizarre scene unfolding across the street, Hannah slowly reached down and opened her window. Cool night air washed through the screen and touched her exposed skin. The sounds of crickets met her ears, nothing more. The ghostly crowd milling about made no sounds at all. One figure, the figure of what appeared to be a young person, slowly drifted across the street. Ever so slowly, this figure, barely moving its legs, moved across the driveway and stopped in the front yard of the Whitaker house. It was a girl, Hannah was certain. Not only was it a girl, but she appeared to be looking up at Hannah, as Hannah looked down at her. A curious chill rose up within Hannah as she watched the girl, now motionless, staring back up at her from the front yard. And she couldn't help but to feel that the mysterious figure wanted something. It was as if she was calling out to Hannah with her mind, connecting with her through some sort of mental energy, some invisible brainwave. Hannah's fright eased as somehow she knew that the strange crowd that had formed where the old cemetery once had been, meant no harm to her. They're ghosts, she thought. They're the ghosts of those who had been buried in the graveyard. The construction workers moved the gravestones and the coffins, but they're the ghosts that have been left behind. Hannah slowly backed away from the window. She made no sound as she tiptoed across her bedroom, down the carpeted hall, carefully making her way down the stairs, through the living room, and slipping quietly out the front door. The girl that had been in the front yard was now waiting for her on the porch. It was impossible for Hannah to distinguish many features about her, except for the fact that she had shoulder-length hair tied with a ribbon, and she was wearing a dress and shoes. Because of her hazy, milky white appearance, there was no way to tell the color of her clothing or her hair. Even her eyes were a ghostly white. Still, Hannah was calmed by the appearance of the strange girl standing on the porch, who slowly began to raise her hand, reaching out to Hannah in the pale, sugary moonlight. Slowly, Hannah raised her arm. The girl's hand felt oddly warm, not firm like that of a human, but softer, sponge-like. Still, she felt the girl's grasp tighten around her hand. The gesture felt welcome, caring, gentle. Then, still holding her hand, the girl turned and slowly led Hannah from the porch, into the yard, and out into the street, where much of the crowd had moved. Some seemed to acknowledge Hannah's presence. They smiled faintly at her, and Hannah smiled back. Still others had appeared to take no notice of her at all. All the while, Hannah held the hand of the girl who had led her away from her home, across the front yard, and into the lane that was still lined with quiet trucks. Then, silently, the crowd began to move as if some unseen signal had been given. Everyone began to drift down Cemetery Lane, away from the Whitaker house, away from what once had been the old cemetery, past the sleeping trucks and idle tractors and still backhoes. The entire crowd, now numbering over 100, moved quietly and slowly through the night. Soon, they had reached the sleepy town, lit only by a few street lights and lamps that burned in a few of the closed cafes and stores. Through all of this, the people of the village slept on. No one saw the ghostly crowd that slowly paraded past the closed storefronts, through the center of town, down a long, narrow dirt road, and finally to a large field. A field that had recently contained tall grass and lofty maple and oak trees. A field that had been recently dug up. A field where the gravestones had been placed uniformly in perfect straight rows and columns. Rolls of green sod had been laid down, covering the freshly dug landscape. The field that had once been empty except for a few stately old trees now contained caskets and coffins buried in the ground. Caskets and coffins that held the remains of the long departed. All around her, Hannah watched as the crowd dispersed and thinned, each individual figure wandering in a different direction around the array of gravestones, seeking and searching in the moonlight, looking for something in particular. One by one, these figures began to sink into the ground as slowly and effortlessly as Hannah had watched them emerge. She was mesmerized by this bizarre scene, unable to look away, but still not feeling afraid. In fact, she felt strangely comforted, holding the hand of the girl that had led her from her home, down Cemetery Lane, through the sleeping village, and to the new graveyard on the outskirts of town. Then the girl began to move again, gently grasping Hannah's hand, pulling her along. Hannah strode easily, casually, until the two girls stood before a large, shadowy gravestone. Here, the girl let go of Hannah's hand and pointed. Hannah stared at the gravestone. In the moonlight, she could read the ancient letters and words that had been engraved so many years ago. She whispered the words, Hannah Jane Whitaker, born June 15, 1910, died December 11, 1919. Reading the words did not create distress. There was nothing uncomfortable about the realization. In fact, Hannah felt serene and peaceful about this new awareness, this strange recognition, this surprising discovery. She looked around. The crowd was gone, and there was no sign of any other ghostly figures. Even the girl that had led her to the new graveyard had vanished. Hannah was alone. Again, she stared at the gravestone and read the words out loud. Hannah Jane Whitaker, born June 15, 1910, died December 11, 1919. She had been just 9 years old. Then, Hannah began to sink into the ground, slowly, without effort, farther and farther, until she had vanished from the earth. Finally, Hannah Jane Whitaker had gone home.